apprentice. I feel the power of the dark side on you. We are in the Lahan system. Can you feel the power that remains even now? So much potential, unbound. And it is there for you to use. I hope that in this place you can progress your training to new heights, apprentice. Immerse yourself within the flow of energy here and allow it to wash over you. Meditate on all that you have learned. Continue your lessons with the saber. There is a flow to the energy around you. I know you can feel it, so learn to follow it. Allow your meditation to sweep you away, and the dark side will show you much. It is time to test what you have learned about the tides of destiny, and it is time for one more lesson on it, through the study of a man we have spoken of many times now. A man around whom destiny swirled so strongly that none could withstand the flow of it when it went against them. We will study the being who would come to be called Revan. Unlocking file. Revan, the fate-bound. Processing. We have already covered Revan's life in detail through our study of the Mandalorian and Jedi Civil Wars. The information we have on his early life prior to these events is scarce, and even what we do have is secondhand. We know that he was taken by the Jedi at a young age, as most are, and that he was a known prodigy from the start. The most interesting fact about Revan's early years was his insatiable curiosity. There had not been a student so ravenous for knowledge since Exar Kun. It is important to note that the Force is like water. Events or choices can cause ripples. These events and choices can manifest again. Remember the teachings of Darth Traya. The Force does have a will, but that will is shaped by our choices. We can affect it, and the events of the new Sith Wars and the choices of Exar Kun had sent ripples through time. Revan's insatiable knowledge should have been the first sign that he was bound by destiny, caught up in the flow of the Force around him. Like Exar before him, he craved new knowledge of the Force. And the Jedi, to their credit, had learned some lessons from their mistakes. They hoarded less from Revan. While the Council did not bless him outright with access to all of their knowledge, they did not restrict him from learning from all the masters he could. Revan would bounce between the many accomplished Jedi of his era, and he would learn all he could from them. He would grow rapidly in power until he was known as one of the Order's greatest knights. The Jedi did well in how they handled Revan as opposed to Exar Kun, but they were blind to the larger picture. The River of Fate is larger than many realize, and it is ever in motion. But this does not mean that the current cannot be read. Beings such as Revan are almost always caught within this current. These prodigies tend to appear at times of great crescendo, times when the tides of fate are rising, about to sweep across the galaxy in a torrent. This was the case in Revan's time. The Mandalorian Wars would break out while Revan was still climbing the ranks of the Jedi. The Council would sense a great darkness coming, but even when the Mandalorians attacked and the worlds began to burn, they debated what to do. They were unsure what the will of the Force was. Their minds had become so constrained by their pacifistic code that they dithered, debating the correct course of action. It was here they made their first true mistake in regards to Revan. The Mandalorian Wars were going to come, regardless of whether or not the Jedi did anything. Events in the galaxy had moved beyond their scope, and the Republic had become caught in the tides of fate. The Force had responded to this changing in the tide. It had sent a being that was capable of meeting the challenge. Again, the Force has a will. Whether or not this will is conscious is still a mystery, even to me. But this will does respond to events in the galaxy. Lord Vitiate, deep within the unknown regions, had managed to shift the tides of fate in his favor. And the Force had evened the board by sending the Jedi Revan. The young Jedi responded to the Mandalorian atrocities almost immediately. He began to speak out against the wishes of the Council, calling for the Jedi to aid those caught up in the conflict. Many would flock to his banner, but still the Council would dither. They refused to recognize the rising tide and acknowledge that such times sometimes require swift action, and that the Force had chosen Revan to be the one to lead such an action. They instead branded him and his followers as outcasts. They disavowed them. Eventually, they even tried to bring Revan in. They had to be forcibly shown a vision by the Force to finally relent to the tides around them. This, understandably, planted the seeds of resentment deep within Revan. He knew what was right. Especially at such a young age, he was a tool of the Force, and it pushed him to war with the Mandalorians. The deaths of the people caught in the fighting wept to him from stars away. How could the Jedi simply do nothing? These thoughts and feelings would push Revan to fully embrace his Revan identity. He would hide his face behind the mask of a Mandalorian woman and become something more. For the first time, he would become fully caught up within Destiny's flow. While before, he had tried to temper his words with adherence to the Jedi Code, he now openly defied the Council and promised to go to war. The Republic would gladly accept him and his followers' aid, and they would quickly turn the tide of the war. These times would begin to allow darkness to seep into Revan's heart. The negative feelings the Jedi Council had planted within him through their mishandling of the situation began to blossom. He became cold, cynical, distant from his men. He would spend their lives as nothing if it meant a swift end to the fighting. His desire to defend the greater good had become perverted by the slow creep of the Bogon. The Jedi had once again failed the galaxy. If they had had the wisdom to recognize the flow of destiny and had accepted it, gone with it, then it is likely the Mandalorian Wars would have ended far differently. If the Jedi Order had joined with the Republic from the beginning, placing the full might of their order behind prodigies like Revan, steered by the experience of their older masters, then the war would have likely ended much more quickly. Millions would still have been alive, and the tides of fate would have shifted into favor of the Republic. Imagine if Lord Vitiate had witnessed a decisive win over the Mandalorians that he had convinced to throw themselves at the Republic. The Mandalorians themselves admit that it was the Jedi who defeated them, and yet it was not the Order's full strength that met them. They failed to concede to the will of the Force, in fact, openly debated against doing so, and as such, the tides of fate began to flow against them. They created their own monster in Revan. He was on his own when he learned the truth of Vitiate, and as such, his sense of duty made it inevitable that he would seek him out. Instead of his courage being tempered with the caution of the Council when it was actually needed, he had only himself to count on, and by then, the dark side had more than left its mark upon him. If the Jedi had been there, perhaps he could have still turned back from the Bogon. But instead, his perverted sense of duty drove him onward into the unknown regions, into the clutches of the Sith. Lord Vitiate was wise. He had by then learned how to read destiny, how to manipulate its flow to his advantage, when to push and when to submit to its flow. He had not foreseen Revan, but because he was aware of the power of destiny, he was able to use him. When Revan would confront Vitiate, the Emperor would sense the power within the young Jedi. He would recognize it as the weight of the Force pushing the man's destiny, and he would use him. Revan and his friend Malik had already been tainted by the Bogon. Vitiate sensed this and assaulted their minds telepathically, hoping to break down any remaining defenses they had. This would prove far easier than even he anticipated, and the pair would fully embrace the dark side at last, kneeling before Vitiate and swearing fealty to him as their new emperor. Vitiate realized that in the end, he could not control one bound-up soul in the will of the Force, but he could use him. And so, he pointed Revan back in the direction of the Republic. He sent the new Sith Lord, searching for the Star Forge. Vitiate knew two things. The first, that Revan was bound by destiny, and as such, if anyone could find the Forge, it would be him. If he did so, and handed it to Vitiate, all the better. But if he did not, and instead rebelled, it was still no loss. He had tainted this scion of destiny with the dark side. Even if Vitiate was betrayed, he knew Revan would first turn his eyes against the Republic. This was what a Sith would do, consolidate their strength before striking. And so, certain of the outcome, the Emperor would unleash Revan upon the galaxy. And once again, the tides of fate would flow against the Republic. During the Mandalorian Wars, it was because the Jedi failed to recognize Revan's destiny. Now, it was because his destiny was aligned against them. Revan was bound by the will of the Force. As such, he was a prodigy, not just in the Force, but also a tactical and martial genius. The Force had given Revan all the tools he needed to wage war, and wage it he did, this time against the Republic. He would quickly overwhelm their military, and while the galactic government would barely manage to stave off defeat, it quickly became inevitable. But it was here that the tides of fate would turn against Revan. Many, including myself, have spent their lives trying to understand the ways in which the Force moves, and still, no one has a certain answer. The reasons why the tide shifted cannot be known. Perhaps because Revan had become an indirect tool of Lord Vitiate, the Force overrode his destiny in order to defy the Emperor's manipulations. There is no real way to know, but it is almost always in moments of desperation that these shifts occur. Remember this, apprentice, or be undone by your enemies in your moment of triumph. For the Jedi Order had become desperate, and in their desperation, they put together a strike team to send against Darth Revan. This team would be led by another prodigy, one Bastila Shan. She was the first prodigy in battle meditation since Nomi Sunrider had become one with the Force. And the Jedi of the era realized that this was an indication that she too was bound by destiny. While the team would not defeat Revan, it would be at this moment that Malak would seize his chance to become Dark Lord. Revan would become wounded, and he would only survive thanks to Bastila's intervention. At this point, the pair's destiny would become intertwined. The Jedi Council would erase Revan's mind and place him under Bastila's command. The pair would be swept up in a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of the Star Forge and the defeat of Darth Malak. Along the way, Revan would recover his memories, and the pair would fall in love. They would have children, and these children would go on to affect the course of the galaxy. In fact, their ancestors would continue to be caught in the flow of destiny hundreds of years later in Grandmaster Satira Shan. Whether or not the Jedi realized their combined destiny, or if they simply erased Revan's memory and placed him with Bastila in a wild hope that his subconscious mind would lead them to an advantage, we can never know. I tend not to give the Jedi much credit. Regardless, their pairing would shift the tides of fate enough back into the Republic's favor that a fragile peace would be able to settle in. For a time, this was true in Revan's personal life. He and Bastila would have some small measure of peace together, but it was not to last. Revan's memories would continue to resurface, and eventually he would begin to remember Lord Vitiate and the threat he posed to the galaxy. He would leave Bastila and his family behind and set off into the unknown regions to defeat the Emperor for good. Along the way, he would encounter his old friend Mitra Surik, and eventually the two would become embroiled in a conspiracy that was already in place against the Emperor. Two Sith, Darth Neris and Lord Scourge, had discovered Vitiate's plan to drain the galaxy of life to increase his power, and they wished to ensure that this could never happen. Lord Scourge would help the Jedi sneak into the imperial capital of Droman Khas in an echo of the journey that Revan and Malak had taken years before. Remember, apprentice, the Force tends to ripple. Things repeat like water spreading outward in sequential rings. Eventually, the group of would-be allies would manage to penetrate Vitiate's inner sanctum. There, they would face the Emperor, but Lord Scourge would be granted a vision by the Force. In it, he saw that it was not they who were destined to defeat the Emperor, and as such, he made a choice. He chose survival, so that he could be there to help when the true day did come. Scourge betrayed the group. Mitra was slain, and Revan was defeated by Vitiate. But the Emperor did not slay him. Vitiate was still very much aware of the weight of Revan's destiny in the Force. By then, the Jedi had experienced the Force in ways few others had, across both sides of the spectrum. He was immensely powerful, and rather than kill him, the Emperor placed Revan in stasis using Sith alchemy to extend his life. Eventually, Vitiate would begin to feed off Revan's power, and he would use it to boost his own strategy and foresight. He used Revan to grow stronger, but this also gave Revan the ability to influence Vitiate in turn. He was able to push the Emperor against the idea of war for hundreds of years, and as such, he delayed the Great Galactic War and gave the Republic and Jedi time to breathe and recover. Despite his defeat, the Echo, the tides of destiny that remained behind Revan, would be enough to suddenly shift the tides of fate against the Emperor. Though the Emperor would go to war, which we will cover in our next history lesson, he would be influenced into accepting a peace which would save the Republic. Eventually, the Jedi would learn of a hidden prisoner who was fueling the Emperor's power, and they would dispatch a strike team to free them. This team would find Revan and would release him from stasis. This would also free Vitiate from Revan's influence, and the war would resume in earnest. This was truly when the tides of fate shifted away from Revan. He was still a powerful Force user, but the part of defeating Vitiate for good belonged to another. While Revan had gotten things moving, had shifted the flow of destiny back in favor of the Republic, it was the duty of another to end the threat. Revan, however, was a man of action, and after informing the Order everything he knew of the Emperor, he set off to enact his own plans. He traveled to a Rakatan space station known as the Foundry, and there began to create an army of droids, which he planned to use against the Empire. However, Vitiate would become aware of this plan, and he would send a strike team to face Revan. Because Revan's destiny was not to defeat the Emperor, Revan himself would finally be defeated. But instead of dying, something strange happened. Revan was so strong in the Force, so aware of its totality, that his spirit fractured. While part of it did rejoin the living Force, the darker aspects of his nature refused death and were left behind, in control of Revan's body. Without his full essence, Revan went insane, and once more fully embraced the dark side. By this time, the destined other, who would come to be known as the Outlander, had driven Vitiate to the brink of defeat. The reborn Revan would track the Emperor's spirit to the Jungle Moon. There, he planned to revive him, so that Vitiate could be defeated for good. The Republic Task Force would be dispatched to stop Revan. The Jedi did not believe him strong enough to defeat the Emperor, and the galaxy could not risk the Emperor's return. Republic forces would clash with Revan's own across the moon, and eventually, this chaos and death would feed Vitiate's spirit enough that he was able to leave Yavin and return to his body on Valkorion. Revan would be enraged at his failure, but the lighter aspect of his being would reach out to the darker half from deep within the Force, and would finally convince the still living man to fully accept that it was not his destiny to defeat the Emperor. The reborn Revan become whole once more. He would then pass on into the nether realm of the Force. What is there to be learned from the story of Revan? We have spoken of him often, and now at length, but it is important to realize the weight that destiny can have. Each of us is caught within the flow of the Force. This is a fact that cannot be denied and can never be escaped. The Force has a will, and sometimes it collects itself more behind certain individuals in order to push the flow of destiny one way or the other. That is not to say that you are powerless to shape destiny. The Force is shaped by life. Your choices can change the tides of fate, even if the flow exists outside of you. It is important that you recognize when the flow is weak enough to be defied, and when you must submit to its pull. Beings like Revan tend to come at moments of crux. He had come before a time of great war, Exar Kun before a time of great upheaval. You must be able to recognize if one of these beings is on the Jajaric board, and you must know how to deal with them. If you can find a way to move the weight of their destiny behind your cause, as Vitiate did with Revan, you can greatly advance your plans. To defy the weight of these individuals' destiny can cause much long-term harm, as it did to the Jedi during the Jedi Civil War. But you must also be able to recognize when destiny has shifted away from such beings. Revan had the weight of destiny behind him, but that destiny was to save the Republic from Vitiate's machinations, not to stop Vitiate himself. Once he had achieved this, the weight of his destiny became lesser. The failure of Revan to recognize that it was not he who would defeat the Emperor led directly to his death, and indirectly to Vitiate returning with renewed strength. Meditate on these things, apprentice. Here in the dark nexus that shrouds the Han, you should be able to feel the pull of fate's current stronger than ever. Think on what I have said. Learn to recognize this pull, both within yourself and in the galaxy around you. Try to focus your talent of discernment and learn how and when to stand against this tide, how and when to submit to it. If you can master the ability to read the tides of destiny, then destiny itself will become a tool you may use to further your agenda. Go now, apprentice. Heed my words, and the lessons of Revan, the fate-bound, he whom destiny swept past all boundaries. And may the Force break your chains.